Right, so we have here on the server side, we have an HTTP endpoint that's listening for incoming post HTTP requests, and presumably it's in the body of the HTTP request. It has some JSON object that we're going to try and parse out from the body and map it to an instance, Java instance, right, and then add it to an array list of users, right, and then return the new list of users that it now includes this new instance. So that's on the server side. So on the client side, let's go hop into the client side. Notice that I'm using Spring Boot Tool Suite to code my Java side, right? In this project, the webdev summer 2019, and so I'm using STS because it's a nicer tool to edit or manipulate and code for Java. Now I also for editing in the same exact project. I have to be able to edit the HTML, the JavaScript, the CSS. I'm using instead WebStorm. Although I'm opening exactly the same project, I'm using it with two different IDs because each ID has its own strengths and weaknesses. So on the client side, on the browser side, if you remember, we had implemented here a single JavaScript class that was hosting all the functions that allowed us to interact with the server side. We looked at find all users, which is the one who's generating the HTTP request using the fetch function, sending this generates an HTTP request to this URL, and that's what kicks off on the server side, executing this particular function right here, find all users. I called it the same on the client side, on the JavaScript, and I called it find all also on the Java side. Not because they have to be the same. It's mostly just for keeping it straight in my own head that these two functions are somehow related. They're only related because here I'm generating an HTTP request, and here I'm listening for that HTTP request. Nothing else. Nothing else. Relates these two functions at all, right? Only the fact that this is generating an HTTP request and this one is listening for the incoming HTTP request, and it's responding with an array of users. Anyway, so what we want to be able to do is do something similar, but to kick off not this GET request, we want to kick off this POST request with that same endpoint, right? What I'd like to be able to do here is that same thing. We'd like to do a fetch to that same endpoint, but instead of generating a GET request, I'd like to generate a POST request, right? So we're done here with the GET, right? For our of our read operation. Let's now implement the POST for being able to create, right? So again, we'll do the same thing. We'll have function. We'll call it the same way, create a user, and again, the naming convention is that I'm going to call this the same name as a function that I have it on the server side, not because they have to be the same, but it's mostly for just keeping it straight in my head. Here, somebody's going to pass it an instance of a user, and what we need to do is to do the same thing. We need to generate a fetch, right, to the same endpoint, but with the difference now is that we need to be able to send over this user as part of the body of this HTTP request, right? So to do that, the fetch function takes a second argument. That second argument is a JSON object, right? And we're going to be using that to configure how this fetch should work. By default, fetch generates a GET. If you don't tell it anything, if you don't configure it, by default, it just generates a GET. If you want anything other than a GET, then you need to configure it. Right? So we need to say that we want the method type to be a POST as opposed to a GET. Right, the default GET. We don't want it to be a GET. This time we want it to be a POST. Also, we want to send over as part of the body, as part of the HTTP body, we want to send this user object. Right, we're going to send this user object, and we're almost done. The only issue here is that this user right now is formatted as a JSON object. Right? We need to be able to format it into more generic format that could be easily consumed by the server. So to do that, we're going to convert this JSON representation into a string representation. And there is a utility that allows us to do that very easily. These utilities that allow you to convert back and forth between strings and JSON and strings, they all live inside of a library that is called JSON, right? And it has here several methods. One of them is, there it is, stringify, right? If we select stringify, what it does is it takes a JSON object and it converts it into its equivalent string representation. Okay, so this is a string that we're going to send across the wire to the over the network to the server that is waiting for this incoming post mapped to that URL. Okay, one more thing, we need to tell the server how to interpret this this string. I mean, this string could be anything, right? It could be us filling out a form. It could be us posting an image, posting a Word document. I mean, it could be anything, right? Embedded in the body that we can attach to the body. This is just a string, and we need to be able to tell the server how to interpret this string. We need to tell it to say that, hey, this is not just any string. It's a string that has a particular format. It's a JSON format, right? So that it'll be able to say and determine that, ooh, yeah, so it's a JSON string that has a particular schema, it's a particular structure, that it will have fields such as ID, username, first name, and so forth. So I'll be able to map it, right, to an object of the same structure, right? So to do that on the client, right, to be able to configure the data type to tell it that this is a JSON formatted string, we do that in the headers. Okay, and the headers itself is another embedded JSON object within the configuration object. So in here, there's all sorts of things that we can configure. We can send cookies. We can send all sorts of things. Well, one of the things that we can configure is the type or the MIME type of the body that is embedded in the HTTP request, and we do that using content type. Content type. We can then configure and say whether this is it's a PDF document, is it an image, a JPEG, is it a Word document? What is it? We're gonna tell the server to interpret this incoming string, right? Incoming to interpret it as application/JSON. Right. This is a standard. It's a well-known standard that identifies content as having JSON content. Okay. All right. Awesome. So we're almost done. Notice that this fetch is pretty much going to do more or less the same thing as this fetch over here, right? With it's the same thing, right? It's going to be an asynchronous call. It's going to go out to the server. The single JavaScript thread is going to come through here. It's not going to wait, right? You're just going to continue, and so at some point the response is going to come back. The browser is going to handle all this asynchronous invocation. We need to be able to whatever response comes back from the server, we need to be able to handle it. We need to the server is going to respond with, presumably it's going to respond with its own its own data, right? It's going to respond presumably with an array of users, right? Presumably with a new user added to that array. So we're going to treat it exactly like we treated earlier, right? As when we were fetching users, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to use a then, just like we did earlier, right? And we're going to take in the function, the response. This is the raw response that's coming from the server, right? That raw response is going to contain it's also going to have a body. It's also going to have headers that is coming from the server. Now we send headers and body to the server. The server responds also with an HTTP response, which also contains a body, a header, and so on and so forth. We're going to take that response. We're going to parse it, right? The .json function, what it does is that it extracts the body content of that HTTP response, right? And then it tries to interpret it as a JSON string, right? And convert that JSON string into an actual JSON object that we can use. And this is what we're going to return. We're going to return this JSON response, right? And we're going to return it here, right, to whoever invoked this create function. Okay. All right. Excellent. So there we have it. We have now implemented the user service, the create user, right, which is responsible for sending these HTTP request objects of users embedded in an HTTP post. Right. Next, we need to actually use this function, as we invoke, as we actually fill out a form, right, and click on plus to send over this user over to the server. So let's do that next.